In the forgotten lands of a once grand kingdom, where the wind howled mournful songs among the ruins and moss covered the cold stones of ancient tales, lived old Elian. His hands, once firm in the art of wood-carving, now trembled with the weight of age and the promise made to his deceased wife to protect his family. With him were his two orphaned grandchildren, Kyle, a boy with shoulders too broad for his young age, and little Ilara, whose dry cough echoed in the night, a cruel reminder of the cold that bit into their bones. Expelled from the village by the cruel lord, who forced them to spend their last coins on an abandoned Gothic chapel atop the cursed hill, they faced the scorn of the villagers and the fury of the elements. The chapel, with its broken stained glass windows and bird nests, was a stone skeleton, a precarious shelter against the harsh winter that was approaching. Each day, Elian and Kale struggled to transform that uninhabitable place into a home, cleaning the moss, improvising fires that barely warmed the icy air, while the distant howl of wolves seemed to mock their misery. Winter, a sharp-toothed beast, snarled ever closer. Its icy winds, once a distant lament, now whipped against the walls of the Gothic chapel, finding cracks in the broken stained glass to invade what they could barely call home. Inside, little Ilara, wrapped in tattered rags, trembled with fever, her dry cough tearing through the night's silence. A sound that wounded old Elian's soul more than any humiliation imposed by the Lord. Kyle, with the eyes of a child who had already seen too much, fed the makeshift fire with damp branches, the faint warmth an empty promise against the cold that gnawed at their bones. Elian watched his granddaughter, his heart aching with helplessness. The weak light of the fire danced on the stone walls, revealing the seeping dampness, the mold spreading like a silent plague. The chapel, with its ruined grandeur, was a cold tomb, not a refuge. He knew they needed more than a dying fire and whispered prayers. They needed light, fresh air, a glimmer of hope that could ward off the shadow of illness that stalked Ilara. His eyes, accustomed to scrutinizing stones and mortar, scanned the solidest wall of the side nave, a windowless section, dense and unforgiving. There, where darkness accumulated most oppressively, Elian saw not a barrier, but an opportunity. A stonemason, even old and weary, still saw the world in terms of structure and possibility. A window. Yes, a window there could bring a little sun, a little of the air Ilara so desperately needed, and perhaps, just perhaps, dispel the melancholy that weighed upon them. The decision was made with the urgency of one fighting against time. The next morning, even before the sun stretched over the cursed hills, Elian and Kyle were already on their feet. The old man with his rusty tools and a hammer with a cracked handle, and the boy with the brute strength of his youth and the determination of one who loves. The wall was imposing, made of heavy, cold-to-the-touch grey stone blocks. They began to work, the rhythmic sound of the hammer against the chisel echoing in the empty vastness of the chapel, a sound that seemed to defy the silence of death that resided there. Each blow was a painful effort for Elian. His muscles, once strong, now protested with every movement. Kyle, with less technique but more vigor, tried to follow his grandfather's steps, removing debris, learning the patience and persistence that stone demanded. The relentless cold penetrated their ragged clothes, and hunger gnawed at their stomachs, but the image of Ilara, pale and fragile, was the fuel that drove them. Hours dragged on like days. The wall seemed to mock their efforts, yielding only in tiny chips. Frustration threatened to set in, but Elian could not afford that luxury. He focused on the mortar, trying to loosen the stones one by one. It was then that, attempting to remove an apparently ordinary block, he noticed something strange. The chisel did not meet the expected resistance. Instead of the muffled sound of solid stone, there was a hollow echo, a sound that did not belong to a load-bearing wall. Elian stopped, the hammer suspended in the air. Kyle looked at him, confused. The old man felt the stone, sensing a slight vibration that was not normal. With more caution, he forced the chisel again, and a piece of the mortar gave way with surprising ease. The stone, when it finally broke free, proved strangely light, and as it fell to the ground, it emitted a different sound, as if it were hollow. Intrigued, Elian examined the adjacent stones. All looked identical from the outside, but when he struck them with the hammer, the same hollow sound resonated. This was no ordinary wall. It was a facade, a disguise. With renewed vigor and a pang of curiosity he hadn't felt in a long time, Elian and Kale began to dismantle the hollow stones more quickly. With each block removed, the darkness behind the wall became more evident, and a peculiar smell of damp earth and something else, something sweet and ancient, began to emanate from the opening hole. What they thought was a solid brick wall was, in fact, a stone curtain, carefully constructed to conceal something. When the last hollow block gave way, it did not reveal daylight, but rather a dark, narrow passage that descended into darkness. A cold, dense air rose from the opening, laden with centuries of mystery. Elian and Kyle exchanged glances, their weariness forgotten, replaced by a mixture of fear and fascination. The window they sought did not exist, but something much older and more secret had just revealed itself. What could be hidden in those depths? The air rising from that newly opened crevice was not just cold. It was dense, laden with the scent of centuries, of damp earth and something more. Something sweet and fermented that Elian couldn't immediately identify. The darkness there was absolute, an impenetrable wall that seemed to swallow the faint light of the makeshift fire. Kyle, wide-eyed, clung to his grandfather's sleeve, a mix of fear and excitement on his childish face. Elian, however, felt a pang of something different. It wasn't just a stonemason's curiosity before a hidden structure, but a grandfather's urgency. Ilara's cough, even muffled by distance, echoed in his mind. They needed warmth, medicine, food. What if that passage led to a safer shelter, to something that could offer a minimum of comfort? Hope, fragile as a dry branch, ignited in his chest. "We need light, Kyle," Elian whispered, his voice hoarse. "Get a longer piece of wood and some oil from the lamp." With trembling hands, the boy obeyed, and soon a piece of wood soaked in a remnant of olive oil crackled, casting dancing shadows into the opening. The flickering flame barely penetrated the darkness, but it was enough. Elian, with the courage only despair can forge, knelt and peered in. The passage was narrow, a rough stone tunnel that descended at a gentle angle, losing itself in the depths. "Stay close to me, boy," Elian said, extending a hand to Kale. "We don't know what's down there." With the old stonemason leading, holding the makeshift torch and Kale close behind, they began their descent. Each step was cautious, the ground uneven and slippery beneath their feet. The sweet, earthy smell intensified with every meter, mingling with an aroma of mold and something metallic, almost imperceptible. The stone walls were cold to the touch, and the silence was so profound that the sound of their own breaths seemed like thunder. Water droplets trickled down the stones, dripping somewhere in the darkness, creating a mournful melody. The passage seemed endless, and weariness began to weigh on Elian's shoulders. Was this a mistake? Were they venturing into a trap too far from poor Ilara? But the image of his granddaughter, pale and feverish, was a whip to his soul, urging him onward. Suddenly, the tunnel opened up. Elian's torch revealed no longer a narrow passage, but a vast chamber, whose dimensions were lost in the shadows beyond the reach of the light. The walls were of carved stone, with a precision that Elian, even in his old age, recognized as the work of masters. It was not a common crypt, nor a villager's cellar. It was something grand, ancient, and forgotten. Rows upon rows of dark wooden barrels, covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, stretched throughout the space. Some were small, others as large as a man. On stone shelves, hundreds of bottles and amphorae rested, sealed with ancient wax, their labels faded but still visible, displaying coats of arms and symbols Elian had never seen, but which emanated an aura of royalty. The sweet, fermented smell was now overwhelming, an intoxicating aroma of aged wine, of centuries of history bottled. Kyle let out a gasp of astonishment, his eyes fixed on the sight. Elian, however, felt something more. As he ran his hand over one of the barrels, he noticed the quality of the wood, the complexity of the ironwork. This was not for commoners' consumption, this was for kings. His eyes, accustomed to searching for details in stones and wood, swept the floor, and that's when he saw it. Amidst the dust and debris, something gleamed, a golden shimmer, subtle at first but unmistakable. Elian knelt, his heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't one, but several coins, scattered like forgotten seeds. He picked one up, feeling the cold, solid weight of the metal. It wasn't copper nor silver. It was pure gold, engraved with the profile of a king who was not the current lord, nor his father, but someone from a much more distant past, a legendary king from the stories his grandmother used to tell. The torch trembled in his hand. He looked at Cale, who had now also noticed the gleam and was picking up a coin. The boy's gaze was one of pure wonder. Elian, however, felt a dizzying sensation. It wasn't just a few coins. Around the oldest barrels, in hidden niches in the walls, and even inside small wooden chests that seemed to have been forgotten, there was more. Piles of coins, golden goblets, inlaid jewels, all covered by the dust of time, but undeniably there. And the wines, those wines, if they were as ancient and royal as they seemed, would be worth fortunes. The mausoleum of the pestilent, the Lord's humiliation, the cursed hill, everything dissolved before that sight. This was not a pauper's crypt, but the secret cellar of an ancient king, a forgotten treasure worth an entire kingdom. The irony was cruel, but the hope that blossomed in Elian's chest was even more overwhelming. Ilara's fever, the hunger, the cold, all of it could be overcome. But with the discovery also came immense danger. A secret like that, if revealed, could cost them more than their lives. The old stonemason clutched the gold coin in his hand, feeling the weight not just of the metal, but of the destiny that had just revealed itself. They had found not a window to the sun, but a door to a world of unimaginable riches and perils. The weight of the gold coin in Elian's palm was more than metal. It was the weight of a destiny turned upside down. The gleam emanating from that forgotten treasure was not just the reflected light of the torch, but the promise of a different life, and the shadow of unimaginable danger. Kyle, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, was still picking up coins, his childish eyes reflecting the wonder of a newly discovered toy. But Elian knew. He felt the cold shiver of truth. The Lord, who had humiliated him and forced him to buy that cursed mausoleum, would never allow such wealth to fall into the hands of a widowed stonemason. If this secret were revealed, there would be no mercy. The joy, if it could be called that, lasted only an instant, crushed under the weight of terror. That gold, that wine, were not just Ilara's salvation. They were a death sentence for all of them, should the news leak out. The intoxicating scent of aged wine, which once seemed a promise, now hung like a warning. "Kyle, stop!" Elian's voice came out as a harsh whisper, almost unrecognizable. The boy looked at him, confused, his hands full of coins. "Don't touch anything else. Don't say a word about this to anyone, not even your sister. Promise me." The seriousness on his grandfather's face, the tension in his voice, made Kyle drop the coins to the ground, the sparkle in his eyes diminishing to give way to childish apprehension. He nodded, not understanding the depth of the request, but feeling the fear emanating from Elian. The old stonemason swept the vast chamber with his eyes, trying to absorb the magnitude of the discovery. Barrels upon barrels, bottles and amphorae lost in the darkness, piles of gold and jewels hidden in niches. This was not just a fortune, it was the legacy of a kingdom, hidden under everyone's noses for centuries, guarded by the silence of death and the cursed reputation of the mausoleum. Elian's mind, once focused on mortar and stone, now whirled with strategies and dangers. They needed time, they needed discretion, and above all they needed Ilara. The image of his granddaughter, pale and coughing, returned with redoubled force. The gold and wine were useless if she didn't survive. "We have to go back, Kyle," Elian said, his voice a little firmer, but still laden with urgency. "And we have to close this up. No one can know." With the makeshift torch trembling in his hand, Elian began to guide Kyle back through the narrow passage. Each step on the return was heavier than the descent. The cold, dense air that once seemed mysterious now felt conspiratorial. The sweet scent of wine, once intoxicating, was now a constant reminder of the secret they carried. Upon reaching the opening in the chapel, the faint light of the fire seemed like a beacon of safety. Elian looked at the hollow stone blocks they had removed. They needed to put them back to make the wall appear intact. It was an arduous task, especially with weariness and adrenaline coursing through their veins. "Help me, Kyle," Elian commanded, his voice now firm. "We need to put every stone back exactly as it was." With renewed determination, fueled by fear and hope, they began to work. Each hollow block was carefully lifted and fitted back into place. Loose mortar pushed in to disguise the intervention. Elian worked with the precision of a man who knew that his life and the lives of his grandchildren depended on the perfection of his disguise. Sweat ran down his forehead, not just from physical exertion, but from the weight of the secret. When the last stone was put back, the wall looked almost as it had before, a solid, expressionless facade. Only a very keen eye, or the touch of an experienced stonemason, would notice the difference. Elian ran his hand over the surface, feeling the coldness of the stone, the illusion of solidity. The secret was sealed for now. They sat by the fire, exhausted, but their minds in turmoil. Ilara slept, her breathing still weak and irregular. Elian watched her, his heart heavy. That gold, that wine. They were the key, but how to use them? How to transform a hidden treasure into bread, into medicine, into warmth, without incurring the Lord's wrath and the curiosity of the entire kingdom? The gold coin Elian had kept, clutched in his fist, burned in his hand like a hot coal. It was a symbol of power, but also of an overwhelming responsibility. He was not a king nor a merchant. He was just an old, widowed, and humiliated stonemason who, by a twist of fate, had stumbled upon a secret that could change the course of history. The night advanced, and the wind howled through the crevices of the mausoleum, a sound that once seemed mournful, now sounded like a whisper of danger. Elian knew the real battle was just beginning. They had found wealth, but now they needed to survive it. The mausoleum of the pestilent was no longer just the home of death. It was the guardian of a secret worth a kingdom, and the promise of a new life, or a brutal end. The tension in the air was palpable, a premonition of all that was to come. Elian couldn't sleep. The gold coin, still clutched in his hand, seemed to pulse with a feverish energy, echoing the warmth of Ilara's forehead. He watched her, his chest tight, each weak breath of the girl a cruel reminder of the urgency. The treasure downstairs in the darkness was salvation, but also a deadly trap. How could a widowed and humiliated stonemason suddenly have access to pure gold without raising the deepest suspicions? The Lord, with his insatiable greed and his vulture's gaze, would not hesitate to crush them. Elian's mind, accustomed to the simple logic of stone and mortar, now grappled with a problem of royal proportions. He needed medicine, nutritious food, a doctor. But all of that cost money, and the money he had was too dangerous to show. Kyle, exhausted, slept soundly by the fire, his childish face free from the worries that tormented his grandfather. Elian looked at the newly sealed wall, a fragile barrier between life and death, between misery and wealth. The secret was heavy, heavier than any stone he had ever lifted. At dawn, a pale sunbeam crept through the crevices of the mausoleum, illuminating the dancing dust in the air. Elara coughed, a dry, painful sound that cut through the silence. Elian knew he couldn't wait. With every passing minute, his granddaughter's life slipped away. He woke Kyle with a gentle touch. "Kyle, my boy, I need you to be strong and brave. I'm going out for a while. You'll stay here with Elara. Don't leave. Don't open the door for anyone. And above all, don't say a word about what we saw down there." The boy, still sleepy, nodded, his eyes wide with his grandfather's seriousness. "But where are you going, Grandpa?" "I'm going to get help for Elara," Elian lied, or perhaps it wasn't a complete lie. He would seek help, but in a way no one could imagine. "Promise me, Kyle." "Not a word." "I promise, Grandpa," Kyle whispered, his voice choked with fear. Elian clutched the gold coin in his pocket, feeling the cold metal against his skin. He needed something less conspicuous, something he could trade without raising suspicions that he had stolen royal treasure. If he tried to sell a gold coin with an ancient king's seal in the village, he would be arrested, or worse, he needed a plan, a risky but necessary plan. The nearest village was small, and everyone knew him. He needed to go further to a larger city, where he would be just another face in the crowd. The city of Oakhaven, a 2-day walk away, was his only hope. There, perhaps, he could find a less scrupulous merchant, someone who wouldn't question the origin of a piece of gold. But what to take? A coin was too much? A ring? A small brooch? He needed something that could easily be found or inherited by a poor stonemason. With his heart pounding, Elian decided he needed one more dive into the darkness. He couldn't take Kale again. The risk was too great. He would wait until nightfall, when darkness would offer some cover, and descend alone. During the day, he prepared the little he had: an old cloth bag, a water skin, a piece of dry bread. He looked at Elara, who seemed even weaker. The fever wouldn't break. He needed to be quick. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, Elian waited until Kyle fell asleep by the fire. With a makeshift torch, he approached the newly repaired wall. Each stone he had so carefully replaced now needed to be removed again. Sweat ran down his forehead as he worked in silence, each movement calculated to make no sound. The passage opened again, revealing the damp darkness and the sweet scent of wine. Elian descended, the torch trembling in his hand. The vast chamber was as he had left it, a sanctuary of forgotten riches. He didn't go for the piles of coins. His eyes swept the stone shelves, looking for something small, discreet. It was then that he saw, in a more hidden niche, a small, dark wooden box, almost camouflaged by dust. Upon opening it, he found a simple yet elegant necklace with a small leaf-shaped gold pendant set with a single deep green precious stone. It wasn't ostentatious, but the quality of the gold and the brilliance of the stone were undeniable. It could be a family heirloom, something a stonemason might have inherited from an eccentric grandmother. He took the necklace, feeling the cold weight and smooth texture of the gold. It was perfect. He hid it inside his shirt, close to his heart. He also took a smaller bottle of wine, sealed and covered in dust. Perhaps he could sell it to a tavern keeper as an old family wine to supplement the money from the necklace. It was a risk, but the bottle seemed less threatening than a royal coin. With his heart in his throat, Elian sealed the passage again, pushing the stones back into place, disguising the opening with the same precision as before. The secret was once again guarded. He looked at Kale and Elara. sleeping. "I will return," he whispered to the wind. "I will return with the cure." And so, under the cloak of night, the old stonemason, now a guardian of secrets and a reluctant merchant, left the mausoleum of the pestilent, heading towards the distant city, carrying with him not only hope, but also the overwhelming weight of a secret that could save them or condemn them to a terrible end. The journey that was beginning was more dangerous than any wall he had ever built. The cloak of night was a heavy veil upon Elian's shoulders as he walked away from the mausoleum. Each step was a silent prayer, each dry leaf beneath his feet, a crackle that seemed to echo throughout the valley. The gold necklace, with its leaf pendant and green stone, weighed on his chest, a burden heavier than any hewn stone he had ever lifted. It wasn't the physical weight, but the weight of hope and danger intertwined. Behind him in the darkness, Kyle and Ilara slept, or at least he hoped they did. The image of his granddaughter, pale and feverish, was a whip in his mind, driving him forward, even as weariness threatened to buckle his knees. The road to Oakhaven was long and treacherous, a dark ribbon winding through hills and forests. Elian, a man of routine, accustomed to the slow pace of village life, felt like a stranger in his own skin. He was no traveler, much less a merchant of royal jewels. With every lengthening shadow, every rustle in the forest, his heart pounded. Bandits were a constant threat on the roads, and an old stonemason, even if he seemed poor, could be an easy target if the gleam of a gold necklace were noticed. He kept his hand over his chest, feeling the jewel beneath his shirt, a warm secret against his cold skin. Days dragged on in a haze of exhaustion. Elian ate the dry bread he had brought, rationing every crumb, and drank water from his waterskin sparingly. The bottle of wine, wrapped in cloth, was in his satchel, a secondary but equally risky gamble. He slept under the stars, his sleep light and disturbed by nightmares of the Lord's guards, of Kale crying, of Ilara wasting away. Each dawn, the sun brought not only light, but a renewed sense of urgency. He had to be quick. Ilara had no time. At the end of the second day, a grey smudge appeared on the horizon, gradually growing into a tangle of rooftops and chimneys. Oakhaven. The city was a labyrinth of narrow streets and crowded houses, a stark contrast to the quietness of his native village. The hum of the crowd, the smell of smoke, spices and sewage, the clamour of merchants, all hit him like a wave. Elian felt small and exposed, a mouse in a nest of cats. He couldn't just walk into the first jewellery shop he found. An old stonemason in worn clothes and road dust, offering such a fine gold necklace. That would raise questions. Questions he couldn't answer. He needed discretion, a place where the origin of goods wasn't the main concern. Elian wandered the streets for hours, his eyes scanning the facades, looking for a sign, an intuition. He passed opulent shops with gleaming display windows and felt the suspicious gaze of the shopkeepers. Finally, in a less busy alley between a noisy tavern and a dye house, he saw a small, rusty sign. Pawn and curiosities, buy and sell everything. The door was ajar, revealing an inviting gloom. With his heart beating like a drum, Elian pushed the door. A bell tinkled softly, announcing his entry. The air was heavy with the smell of mold, metal, and something indefinable, ancient. Piles of dusty objects, books, weapons, statuettes, cheap jewels, filled the shelves and tables. Behind a dark wooden counter, a corpulent man, with an aquiline nose and small, astute eyes, raised his head. His gaze was quick and assessing. "Can I help you, old man?" The voice was hoarse but not hostile. Elian cleared his throat, trying to control the tremor in his hands. I have something to sell, a family jewel." He pulled the necklace from inside his shirt, revealing the gold leaf pendant. The green stone, even in the gloom, caught the light and gleamed. The man's eyes narrowed. He took the necklace with thick fingers, turning it under the light of an oil lamp. Good gold. The stone. Interesting. Not a common family jewel, not for a stonemason, if I may say so. The tone was neutral, but Elian felt the prick of suspicion. My grandmother, she was an eccentric woman, had a mysterious past. Elian improvised, his voice firmer than he expected. She left this to me. The merchant gave a toothless smile. Mysterious, yes, and valuable, but my dear, family jewels with a mysterious past usually come with questions. And questions cost money. He tossed the necklace back onto the counter. I can offer you a fair sum, considering the risks. He named a value that was a fraction of what Elian knew the necklace was worth, but still, it was more money than he had ever seen in his life. Elian's throat tightened. It was a robbery, but he had no choice. I also have this, he said, taking the bottle of wine from his satchel. Old wine, also from the family. The merchant took the bottle, wiping off the dust with his thumb. He sniffed the cork, then tasted a drop. His eyes widened slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. Wine. Interesting, but I'm not a wine merchant. I can add a few coins to the necklace's price for it, to get rid of the bottle. Elian nodded, desperation overriding any desire to negotiate. He needed the money, and he needed it now. The merchant counted the coins, a sweet and strange sound in Elian's ears. He took them, feeling their cold, real weight in his palm. It was enough. Enough for medicine, for food, perhaps even for a doctor. Thank you, Elian murmured, turning to leave. One last thing, old man, the merchant called. Elian stopped, his body tense. If your grandmother has any more of these family curiosities, feel free to bring them. I am a discreet man. There was a glint in the merchant's eyes, a suggestion that he didn't believe the grandmother's story, but was willing to overlook the truth for a good deal. Elian merely nodded, without turning, and hurried out into the busy street. The fresh night air had never seemed so welcome. He had the money, but the feeling of relief was overshadowed by a new wave of fear. The merchant knew, or at least suspected. The secret, however much he tried to hide it, was beginning to reveal itself. With the money clutched in his fist, Elian rushed to the nearest apothecary, bought the most expensive and effective medicines he could find, and then nutritious food. With each purchase, he felt a pang of guilt for spending the king's gold, but Ilara's image superseded any scruple. Night was falling as Elian left Oakhaven, his heart heavy with the urgency of his return. The journey back would be equally perilous, but now he had something to lose and something to gain, his granddaughter's life. The mausoleum, once a symbol of his humiliation, was now the fortress of his secret and the home of his family. He needed to get there before the darkness of illness consumed Ilara, or before the darkness of the outside world's greed discovered what was hidden beneath the stone floor. The true race against time had begun. The path back to the mausoleum was an inverted shadow of the journey there. If before each step was heavy with uncertainty, now it was driven by a feverish urgency. Elian felt no weariness, only the incessant pounding of his heart and the image of Ilara ever more vivid in his mind. The money, once a cold and strange weight, was now a promise of life clutched in his fist, even if, with each coin, he smelled the risk. The night was a cloak of dangers. The sounds of the forest, once merely nature's murmur, now seemed like whispers of thieves, the rustle of leaves, the shuffle of boots. In every shadow, Elian saw a pair of hungry eyes, with every broken branch, the sound of an ambush. He forced himself onward, his aching muscles protesting, but the will to arrive in time was stronger than any pain. He could not fail, not now. He remembered the pawn merchant's shrewd gaze, that glint in his eyes that said, "I know there's more." That suspicion was a seed planted, and Elian knew that seeds, once planted, tend to germinate. The necklace and the wine were just the tip of the iceberg, and the merchant, with his network of informants and his thirst for curiosities, could easily unearth the rest. The secret was no longer just with Elian. A part of it, a shadow, hung over Oakhaven. Days merged into a desperate race. Elian didn't stop to rest, only to drink a sip of water or chew a piece of dry bread, while his eyes scanned the horizon. With each mile covered, hope grew, but so did anxiety. What if it was too late? What if the fever had taken Ilara while he was away, bargaining with a man who reeked of greed and secrets? Lie under the pale moonlight, the mausoleum came into view, a dark and imposing silhouette against the night sky. Elian ran the last few meters, the air burning in his lungs, his heart pounding like a war drum. The wooden door groaned as he opened it, and the silence that greeted him was more frightening than any forest noise. Kyle, Ilara. His voice was a hoarse whisper, almost unrecognizable. Kyle, huddled near his sister, lifted his head. His eyes were red and swollen from crying, but there was a flicker of relief at seeing his grandfather. "Grandpa, you're back!" Elian knelt beside Ilara. The girl was paler than he remembered, her breathing shallow and irregular. Fever burned on her forehead. He felt a tightening in his chest, a cold fear that threatened to paralyze him. But there was no time for despair. With trembling hands, he took the medicine vials from his satchel. A cough syrup, a powder for the fever, and a paste for her chest. He mixed the powder with a little water and carefully made Ilara drink it. Then he applied the paste to her chest and covered her with an extra blanket. "Food, Kale," Elian said, his voice still hoarse. "I brought fresh bread, cheese, and dried meat. Eat some and give some to Ilara when she wakes up." Kyle, wide-eyed, took the bread. The sight of food, a luxury they hadn't seen in weeks, brought a small smile to his tired face. Elian watched his granddaughter, waiting, praying. Hours dragged on. Elian sat beside Ilara, holding her small, feverish hand, feeling the warmth of her body. He didn't sleep, not for a moment. Every breath of the girl was monitored, every movement a hope or a fear. In the middle of the night, Ilara's fever seemed to subside a little. Her breathing, though still weak, became more regular. A fine sweat covered her forehead. Elian wiped it with a damp cloth, and for a brief moment the girl's eyes opened, cloudy and sleepy. "Grandpa?" she whispered, her voice faint as a thread. "I'm here, my flower," Elian replied, tears streaming down his face. "I'm here." Ilara smiled weakly before falling back asleep. It wasn't a complete cure, but it was an improvement, a chance. The medicine was working. The relief that flooded him was so overwhelming that he felt his knees buckle. He had succeeded, for now, but the feeling of relief was quickly replaced by a new wave of anxiety. The money he had managed to get would barely cover the medicine for a few more days, and the food, though abundant now, wouldn't last forever. He had exhausted his family jewels. What would he do next? The king's secret, guarded beneath the stone floor, was the only answer. But how could he use this wealth without attracting the attention of the Lord or other greedy eyes? The pawn merchant was just the beginning. The world outside was a viper's nest, and Elian, a simple stonemason, was now at the center of a dangerous game he barely understood. He looked at the wall of hollow bricks, the disguised entrance to the secret cellar. The gold and wine, worth a kingdom, were a blessing and a curse. They had saved Ilara today, but could condemn them tomorrow. Elian knew he could no longer afford to be just a stonemason. He needed to think, to plan, and to act with the cunning of a king, or the discretion of a thief. The real battle was no longer against illness, but against greed and power. And Elian, the old stonemason, was alone to fight. The morning sun, filtering through the crevices of the mausoleum, brought not only light, but the harsh reality that his family's life now depended on his ability to navigate a sea of secrets and dangers. The race against time had been won, but the war, the true war, was just beginning. The idea of using the gold directly, even in small portions, still frightened him. But there was no other way out. He needed a way to legitimize a small part of that treasure. With a heavy sigh, Elian lit a small fire in the center of the mausoleum, using some dry wood he had saved. The warmth was welcome in the cold, damp air. He opened the wall of hollow bricks, revealing the darkness of the cellar. With his heart pounding, he reached inside, fumbling among the piles of coins and artifacts. His fingers found a small object, perhaps a fragment of an ornament, less showy than the others, but undeniably pure gold. He pulled it out. It was a small piece, perhaps the size of his fingernail, but dense and heavy. Carefully, Elian placed the fragment on a smooth stone, and using a small hammer he used for detail work, began to strike it, shaping it. The metal, heated by the fire, yielded slowly. He couldn't create a coin, that would be too obvious. But perhaps a button, an old, heavy metal button, which could have been from a nobleman's garment, or a small weight for a scale. Something a stonemason might find on a construction site, or inherit. He worked for hours, concentration warding off fear, transforming the raw gold into a simple object, but with a touch of art. A solid gold button with a worn design that looked centuries old. At dawn, with Kale and Ilara still sleeping, Elian wrapped the button in a piece of cloth. He knew he couldn't go to the pawn merchant again. He needed a less discerning place. There was a small fair on the outskirts of the city where second-hand merchants and artisans sold their wares without many questions. It was risky, but it was the only chance. He kissed Ilara's forehead and whispered to Kale, who woke up drowsily. "Take care of your sister, my son. I'll be back before noon." Anxiety tightened his chest, but the image of Ilara, pale and fragile, was the fuel for his courage. He was a stonemason, not a thief, but he would do whatever it took to protect his family. Elian's silent war was about to begin in the market, where a simple gold button could mean the difference between life and death. The creaking wooden door of the mausoleum closed behind Elian with a groan that seemed to echo his own apprehension. The cold morning air bit at his skin, but it was the chill of fear that truly pierced him. Leaving Kyle and Ilara alone, even for a few hours, was torture. Kyle, though a brave boy, was just a child. And Ilara. Her breath was still a fragile whisper, a constant reminder of the battle she was fighting. The gold button, wrapped in cloth, was a strange weight in his pocket, a mixture of hope and danger. He walked along the dusty paths leading to the city's outskirts, each step a silent prayer. His eyes swept the surroundings, searching for any shadow that might be a spy, any familiar face that might recognize him. He was an invisible man, a widowed stonemason living in a mausoleum, but the secret he carried made him the most visible and vulnerable man in the kingdom. With each house he passed, he imagined curious eyes behind the windows, whispers about the old stonemason who had vanished and reappeared in such a macabre place. The outskirts fair was a whirlwind of colors, sounds, and smells. The cries of vendors, the bleating of sheep, the aroma of fresh bread mingled with the acrid scent of spices and sweat. It was a place where rules were looser, where transactions were made with a glance and a nod, and where the origin of an object was less important than its perceived value. But it was also a viper's nest, where thieves and swindlers mingled with honest merchants. Elian needed to be cunning, but not obvious. He mingled with the crowd, his grey eyes sweeping the stalls, looking for a face that inspired a minimum of trust, or at least disinterest. He avoided goldsmiths, jewelers, anyone who could assess gold with a trained eye. He needed someone who bought curiosities, antiquities, without asking too many questions. His eyes landed on an old stall, covered by a tattered awning, where a corpulent man, with a grizzled beard and tired eyes, sold a miscellany of objects: cracked pots, rusty tools, some faded pieces of clothing, and metal trinkets. It seemed like the kind of place where a gold object, however valuable, might be seen as just another old piece. Elian approached, feigning interest in an old shovel. "Good morning, sir," he said, his voice a little hoarser than usual. The merchant looked up without much enthusiasm. "Good morning, stonemason. Looking for a shovel to dig your own grave?" He laughed at his own joke, a harsh, humorless laugh. Elian forced a smile. "No, just thinking of fixing a roof. I need something to scrape old mortar." He fumbled in his pocket, feeling the button. "But perhaps I have something that might interest you, sir." With a calculated movement, he unwrapped the button, revealing it. The gold gleamed even under the dark awning. The merchant, who had previously seemed bored, widened his eyes. He took the button, turning it between his thick fingers. His eyes, once tired, now held a glint of interest, almost of greed. "Where did you get this, stonemason?" The merchant's voice was low, almost a whisper, but laden with dangerous curiosity. Elian had rehearsed his story. "Family heirlooms, sir, from my grandfather. He was a man of means before everything was lost. My wife fell ill and, well, I need money for medicine and food for my children. It's all I have left." He tried to appear as desperate and honest as possible, his voice choked with the genuine emotion he felt for Ilara. The merchant examined the button more closely, biting it lightly to test the metal's purity. "It's gold, yes, ancient, but a button. It's not a coin. It doesn't have the king's seal." He hesitated, weighing the object in his palm. "I could give you 2 silver coins." 2 silver coins. It was little, far too little for a solid gold object. Elian's heart tightened. He knew he was being robbed, that the merchant was taking advantage of his situation, but he couldn't bargain too much, couldn't raise more suspicion. He couldn't leave and look for another buyer. The risk of being noticed was too great. "Sir, please," Elian pleaded, his voice genuinely supplicating. "My daughter is dying. 2 coins won't be enough for the medicine. 3, please, 3 silver coins." The merchant sighed, feigning reluctance, but Elian saw the glint of satisfaction in his eyes. 3 coins, then. "But don't come back with more of these heirlooms later, stonemason. I don't want trouble with the guard." Elian nodded quickly, relief mixed with humiliation. He took the 3 silver coins, feeling their cold, welcome weight in his hand. It was a small sum, but it was a start. It was enough to buy Ilara's medicine for a few more days, perhaps a piece of meat for soup, and some nails and a sturdier hammer to begin fortifying the mausoleum. He quickly moved away from the stall, feeling the merchant's eyes on his back. The fair seemed even noisier now, the tension of his mission diminishing, but the fear of having been discovered still pursued him. He bought the medicines at the apothecary, paying with 1 of the silver coins, and then went to the bakery, where he bought 2 large loaves of bread and a piece of cheese. Finally, at the blacksmith's, he acquired a heavy hammer and a handful of long, thick nails, justifying the purchase as tools for an urgent repair job. The path back to the mausoleum was lighter, but no less vigilant. The coins in his pocket, the smell of bread and cheese in his hands, were tangible proof of his small victory. He had succeeded. He had transformed a piece of the treasure into life, into safety. But the feeling of being on a tightrope, with the abyss of discovery and ruin on one side and the hope of a future for his children on the other, was overwhelming. Upon reaching the mausoleum, Elian opened the door with renewed caution. Kyle was sitting beside Ilara, who was still sleeping, but with a slightly better color in her face. The boy looked up, a mixture of relief and concern in his gaze. "Father, you're back." Elian smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "Yes, my son, and I brought food and more medicine for your sister." He placed the purchases on the makeshift table, and also some tools. While Ilara received her dose of medicine and Kale devoured the bread, Elian looked at the wall of hollow bricks, the entrance to the secret cellar. The gold was there, waiting. He had taken the first step. He had proven he could navigate the dangers of the outside world. But the true battle, that of transforming that mausoleum into an impenetrable fortress and protecting his secret, was just beginning. He picked up the new hammer, feeling the weight of the tool in his hand. It was time to build, to fortify, to fight. Elian's silent war had begun in the market, but it would be fought and won, or lost, within the stone walls of his new home. The new hammer, heavy and robust, was an extension of his will. Elian gripped it, feeling the cold metal against his calloused palm. The wall of hollow bricks, which concealed the secret cellar, now seemed like a portal to an uncertain future. He had taken the first step. He had proven he could transform gold into life. But the true battle, that of transforming that mausoleum into an impenetrable fortress and protecting his secret, was only just beginning. While Kyle, his belly full of bread and cheese, watched Ilara sleep more calmly. Elian began his work. The mausoleum, with its cold stone walls and cracks, was a solid structure, but not secure. He started with the main door, the same one that groaned mournfully every time it was opened or closed. With the long nails and hammer, he reinforced the hinges, added a heavy wooden bar that could be locked from the inside, and sealed the cracks with mortar he had saved from an old job. Each hammer blow was an echo of his determination, a sound that, to him, meant protection. Kyle, sensing his father's seriousness, approached. "Can I help, Father?" Elian smiled, a tired smile. "Yes, my son. Hold this lantern for me. We need light to see the cracks." Together, father and son worked in silence, the boy holding the lantern, while Elian inspected every corner, every crevice. He sealed the small openings in the grated windows, not to block out light, but to make it harder for curious eyes to peer in. The mausoleum, which once seemed like a prison, was slowly becoming a refuge. With each crack filled, each nail hammered, Elian felt a small victory. He was using his stonemason skills, not to build for others, but to protect what was his. The tension, however, never left him. With every creak of a branch outside, every shadow that moved with the wind, his heart leaped. The fair, the merchant, the silver coins. All were constant reminders that the world outside was dangerous, and his secret was a ticking time bomb. Night fell, and Elian, exhausted, finally stopped. The mausoleum was safer, but still not a fortress. He needed more wood, more mortar, perhaps even a way to hide the crypt's entrance itself. But for now, it was enough. Ilara was sleeping soundly, her breathing more regular, her skin with a little more color. The sight of her was his reward, the fuel for his fight. The next morning, while Kyle and Ilara still slept, Elian returned to the secret cellar. The lantern light danced over the piles of gold and bottles of wine. The gleam of the metal was almost mesmerizing, a promise of wealth and at the same time a silent threat. He couldn't continue melting down the gold and transforming it into small objects. It was too risky, too slow, and the fair merchant had already shown dangerous interest. He needed a different strategy, something that wouldn't raise suspicion, something that could be done on a larger scale. His eyes scanned the stone walls of the cellar, the same stones he, as a stonemason, knew so well. And then, an idea began to form in his mind. A bold, dangerous idea, but perhaps the only one that could work. Elian picked up a piece of raw gold, a little larger than the previous one. He examined it, feeling its weight and density. What if he didn't try to hide the gold, but rather disguise it? What if he used his stonemason skills to create something that looked like a piece of stone, but was in fact gold? He could sculpt the gold into shapes that mimic decorative stones, perhaps even small statues or reliefs that could be sold as antiquities or archaeological finds from an ancient construction site. It was a risky idea. It would require time, skill, and a convincing story. But it was better than continuing to sell buttons. There was still the problem of where to sell. The outskirts fair was a risk, but perhaps there were other places. Perhaps he could look for merchants of ancient artifacts, those who dealt with unique pieces and didn't care as much about the origin, as long as the piece was authentic in its appearance. Elian spent hours in the cellar, not melting the gold but studying it. He took his sculpting tools, the same ones he used for the finest details in his stoneworks. With a tiny chisel and a light hammer, he began to work on a small piece of gold. The idea was to create a small piece that looked like a polished riverstone, but with a subtle gleam that only a trained eye would recognize as gold. The tension was palpable. Each strike of the chisel was a step towards freedom or ruin. He was not a forger, but he was about to become one. A forger of artifacts, using the king's gold to save his own family. The irony was not lost on him. By the end of the day, he had a small stone of gold, polished and irregularly shaped, that seemed to have been sculpted by nature, but with a touch of art. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. He hid it carefully, knowing that this new strategy would be even more dangerous than the last. Elian's silent war was not just against Ilara's illness or the Lord's humiliation. It was a war of intelligence, of disguises, of survival. And he was determined to win, one gold stone at a time. The mausoleum, now safer, guarded not only a treasure, but also the secrets of a stonemason who was transforming into a master of dissimulation, all to protect his children. Night brought a brief rest, but Elian's mind was already plotting the next steps, the next risks, the next disguises. The small, polished, irregular stone of gold rested in Elian's calloused palm. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The flickering light of the lantern in the secret cellar made the metal gleam subtly, almost deceptively. He was not a forger by nature, but necessity. The urgency of Ilara's life and Kael's future were shaping him into something he never imagined he would be. The silent war he was now fighting was not just against illness or humiliation. It was a war of intelligence, of disguises, of survival, and he was determined to win, one gold stone at a time. Night brought a brief rest, but Elian's mind was already plotting the next steps, the next risks, the next disguises. He knew he couldn't risk the same fare with the same merchant. That man had already shown dangerous interest, and the repetition of heirloom buttons or river stones would inevitably raise suspicions. He needed a new stage, a different audience, perhaps even one more accustomed to the ambiguity of origins. In the following days, Elian divided his time between caring for his children and perfecting his new art. Ilara, though still weak, showed signs of improvement, and Kael, with renewed energy, helped his father keep the mausoleum secure. Together, they reinforced a few more windows, sealed cracks, and even improvised a small garden in the back, using the fertile soil Elian had found near an ancient grave. Each small improvement to the stone structure was an act of defiance against the outside world, another brick in the fortress of their hope. But it was in the secret cellar that the true transformation occurred. With his stonemason's tools, the same ones he once used to sculpt angels and gargoyles for the wealthy, Elian now sculpted gold. He experimented with different shapes, textures, and even tried to imitate the wear of time, the marks of erosion. The idea was to create pieces that looked like they had been unearthed, ancient artifacts that could be sold to collectors or antiquity merchants, those who valued rarity and history more than immediate origin. He wasn't just sculpting gold, he was sculpting a narrative, a false history for each piece. His first, more ambitious creation was a small figure, no larger than Cale's thumb, that looked like a fragment of an ancient statuette, perhaps of a forgotten god or a mythical animal. He polished it, lightly scratched it to give it an aged appearance, and covered it with a thin layer of dust and earth collected from the cellar floor to simulate a recent excavation. The gleam of the gold was still there, subtle but undeniable to a trained eye. Tension was a constant companion. Each strike of the chisel, each scrape, was a risk. He knew that if he were discovered, it wouldn't just be imprisonment, but death. The thought of leaving Cale and Ilara alone in the world was a torment that drove him to be even more meticulous, even more cautious. Lie. The day came when Elian decided he had a piece ready to sell. He chose the small statuette, carefully wrapped it in a piece of cloth, and hid it in his pocket. This time, he wouldn't go to the outskirts fair. He had heard of an older market in the heart of the city, a place where artifact merchants and collectors gathered in narrow alleys and dusty shops. Far from the curious eyes of the common guard, it was a place of whispers and discreet transactions. The journey there was longer and more dangerous. Elian mingled with the crowd, his eyes scanning every face, every shadow. The city was a labyrinth of bustling streets, filled with smells and sounds he rarely experienced. He felt the weight of the statuette in his pocket, a burden of hope and fear. Upon arriving at the antique market, Elian found himself in a different world. The shops were dark, filled with strange objects, broken pottery, rusted jewels, yellowed parchments. The air was heavy with the smell of mold and history. He looked for a merchant who seemed more interested in unique pieces than in large volumes. His eyes stopped at a small shop, even dustier than the others, with an almost illegible sign that read Eldrin's Antiquities. Inside, an elderly man, with spectacles perched on his nose and a magnifying glass hanging from his neck, examined a broken vase. His eyes were astute, accustomed to discerning hidden value. Elian hesitated for a moment, feeling cold sweat trickle down his back. "Good morning, sir," he said, his voice a little hoarse. The merchant looked up, assessing Elian with a penetrating gaze. "Good morning, stonemason. What brings you to this humble establishment?" I found something," Elian began, his mind racing to weave the story he had rehearsed. "Working in an ancient ruin, on the outskirts of the city, an excavation. It was hidden, almost forgotten." He took the statuette from his pocket, revealing it with almost reverent care. Eldrin took the piece, his thin, wrinkled fingers examining every detail. He turned it under the faint light, used his magnifying glass, and even sniffed it. The silence in the shop was deafening. Elian felt his heart pound like a drum. He could see the glint in the merchant's eyes, the same glint he had seen in the fair merchant's eyes. But this one was different, more calculating, more experienced. "Interesting," Eldrin murmured, his voice hoarse. "The shape, the patina. It looks ancient, yes, but the material." He ran his thumb over the surface, and Elian held his breath. "It's not stone, stonemason. It's too heavy for its size, and there's a gleam, subtle but undeniable." Elian's world seemed to spin. He had been discovered. Ruin, prison, his children. Eldrin looked up again, an enigmatic smile playing on his lips. "It's gold, isn't it? Or at least a very rich alloy. And very well worked to appear as something it's not. A master's work, I must say." He tilted his head. "Where did this really come from, stonemason? Don't give me stories of ruins. I've dealt with truth, or the lack thereof, for too long." Elian swallowed hard. He was on a tightrope, and the abyss was right below. But Eldrin didn't seem angry, just curious. I can't say, sir. It's a secret. But I assure you it wasn't stolen. It's a find. An inheritance, in a way. Eldrin chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. Heirlooms always make the best stories. Very well, stonemason. I'm not interested in the origin, as long as it doesn't bring the guard to my door. What interests me is the piece. It's unique, and the craftsmanship. It's exquisite. He placed the statuette back in Elian's hand. How much for your heirloom? Relief flooded Elian, but he maintained his composure. I need a lot, sir. My daughter is ill, and I need materials to repair my home. Eldrin pondered, his eyes fixed on the piece. I will give you 10 silver coins, and if you have more heirlooms like this, you can bring them, but let them be as well made as this one, and don't come to me with river stones. 10 silver coins. It was more than he had imagined. It was a fortune compared to the 3 coins from the fair merchant. Elian nodded, barely able to contain the tremor in his hands as he accepted the coins. Thank you, sir. I will bring more. He left Eldrin's shop with a mixture of euphoria and dread. He had succeeded. He had transformed the king's gold into life for his children in an even riskier but also more lucrative way. But the merchant knew. He knew it was gold, and he knew Elian was disguising it. Elian's silent war had escalated. He was no longer just a stonemason. He was an artist of deception, a master of dissimulation. And the mausoleum, now safer, guarded not only a treasure, but the secrets of a man who was willing to do anything to protect what he loved. Night brought a brief rest, but Elian's mind was already plotting the next steps, the next risks, the next disguises. With each step, with each new piece, he moved further from the humiliated stonemason and closer to the man who defied an entire kingdom. The cold city breeze seemed to carry not only the smell of smoke and spices, but also the weight of a new reality for Elian. The 10 silver coins in his pocket were a heavy burden, a mixture of relief and dread. He had succeeded. Ilara would have her medicine. Kale would have food, and perhaps, just perhaps, they could have a glimmer of hope. But the price... The price was not just the disguised gold, but the soul of an honest stonemason, now a master of deception. The path back to the mausoleum was a silent torture. Every shadow seemed to harbor a pair of curious eyes. Every laugh in the street sounded like mockery. Eldrin knew. The old merchant, with his astute eyes and enigmatic smile, had seen through Elian's facade with disturbing ease. That man was not merely a buyer, he was a player, and Elian had just entered his game. The promise of more heirlooms was both a blessing and a curse, an invitation to delve deeper into the web of dissimulation. Upon arriving at the mausoleum, Elian smelled the familiar scent of damp earth and ancient stone, an aroma that once oppressed him, but was now a refuge. Kyle waited for him at the door, his eyes shining with expectation. Ilara, paler than ever, rested on her makeshift bed, her cough still a constant painful sound. "Father, did you get it?" Kyle asked, his voice low so as not to wake his sister. Elian nodded, taking the coins from his pocket and showing them to Kale. The boy's eyes widened. 10 silver coins. It's a fortune. It's enough for Ilara's medicine and for food for a while, Elian said, feeling a knot in his throat. He couldn't tell Kale the truth. He couldn't taint his son's innocence with the weight of his secret. It was a good find, son. A rare piece. Night brought a brief, but precious, respite. Elian bought the most expensive medicine for Ilara, and within a few days the improvement was visible. Her cough lessened, the fever subsided, and some color returned to the girl's face. Kyle, with a full belly, helped his father with renewed vigor, reinforcing the mausoleum's defenses, unaware of the true battle his father was fighting. But Elian's mind found no rest. Eldrin had issued a challenge. Let them be as well made as this one, and don't come to me with river stones. The words echoed in his head. He couldn't simply melt the gold and sell it. He needed to create. He needed to be an artist of deception. In the secret cellar, under the flickering light of the lantern, Elian immersed himself in his new art. He studied the patterns of the mausoleum's ancient stones, the worn designs on the tombs, the forgotten forms of lesser gods that adorned the walls. He used his stonemason's tools, now with a different precision and intent. He wasn't just sculpting gold. He was imitating history, the erosion of time, the hand of long-forgotten artisans. His next creation was a small medallion, with a symbol that looked like an ancient rune, worn at the edges, as if it had been carried for centuries. He covered it with a dark patina, mixing earth and soot, and then lightly polished it so that the golden gleam emerged only at strategic points. Like a secret revealed by time, the process was slow, meticulous, and exhausting. Each piece was a risk, each hammer blow a reminder of the abyss that awaited him if he were discovered. As Elian delved deeper into his dark art, the outside world began to close in around the mausoleum. Elian's absence from the outskirts fair did not go unnoticed. The merchant who had bought his first heirloom buttons began to ask discreet questions, and more disturbingly, a city guard, a corpulent man with a thick moustache, was seen patrolling the cemetery's surroundings with unusual frequency. He didn't enter, merely observed from afar, his eyes sweeping the shadows, as if searching for something or someone. Elian noticed the guard. His heart beat faster each time he saw the man's imposing silhouette. Was it a routine patrol? Or had someone spoken? Did the Lord still remember the humiliation? Paranoia was a constant fog, clouding his thoughts. He further reinforced the windows, sealed the cellar door with an extra layer of mortar, and even began to cover the crypt's entrance with bushes and loose stones, trying to make it look like just another abandoned part of the cemetery. The tension within the stone walls was almost palpable. Kyle, though he didn't know the reason, felt his father's anxiety. "Is everything all right, Father?" he would ask, his large, worried eyes fixed on Elian. "It is, son, just... we have to be careful. The world out there is a complicated place," Elian replied, forcing a smile. He felt the weight of his lies, but Ilara's improved face was his justification, his absolution. Lee, the medallion was ready. It was a masterwork, he knew. It wasn't just gold. It was a story, an illusion so well constructed that even Eldrin would have difficulty unraveling it immediately. But the risk was greater now. The guard, the fair merchant. The city seemed to be shrinking, and the mausoleum, once a refuge, was beginning to feel like a trap. Elian wrapped the medallion in a dark cloth, feeling the weight of the piece in his hand. It wasn't just gold, it was his children's lives, the hope of a future, and a king's secret. With each step, with each new piece, he moved further from the humiliated stonemason and closer to the man who defied an entire kingdom, a piece of gold disguised as history, a secret hidden in plain sight. Elian's silent war was no longer just against illness and humiliation. It was a war against time, against discovery, against the very nature of truth. And he was about to re-enter the battlefield with a new disguise and an even heavier secret. The medallion, wrapped in dark cloth, was a strange weight in Elian's hand. It wasn't the weight of the gold itself, but the weight of the lie, of hope, and of imminent danger. Every fiber of his being screamed to stay in the mausoleum, to protect his children from the shadows spreading across the city. But Ilara needed more medicine, and Kyle, though stronger, still had the hungry gleam in his eyes that Elian knew so well. The silent war demanded one more battle. He sealed the cellar door with a silent prayer, making sure the freshly applied mortar looked old and faded. He covered the crypt's entrance with more bushes and stones, transforming it into an indistinguishable part of the ruin. Every movement was calculated, every precaution a shield against discovery. The city, under the pale morning sun, seemed more hostile than ever. Elian felt the stares, imagined the whispers. Paranoia was a heavy cloak, and he hunched under it, trying to appear as just another tired stonemason on his way to work. But the medallion in his pocket burned, a living secret, and with each step he felt he was walking on hot coals. He spotted the guard. The corpulent man with his thick moustache stood near the main square, not far from the street leading to Eldrin's shop. His eyes swept the crowd, but seemed to linger a little longer on passers-by coming from the direction of the cemetery. Elian averted his gaze, quickening his pace, blending into the crowd, his heart pounding like a war drum. Was it a coincidence, or was the noose tightening? Eldrin's shop was a safe haven, and at the same time a viper's den. The air inside was dense with the scent of exotic spices, old wood, and the unmistakable aura of money. Eldrin was behind the counter, his astute eyes fixed on a parchment. He looked up when Elian entered, a subtle smile playing on his lips. "The stonemason returns," Eldrin said, his voice hoarse. "And with a new heirloom, I presume." Elian nodded, taking the medallion from the cloth and placing it on the counter. The faint light of the shop danced over the dark patina, revealing the golden gleam only at the worn points, as if history had revealed a glimpse of its true nature. Eldrin took the piece, his long, thin fingers examining it with almost surgical precision. He turned the medallion, feeling its weight, tracing the ancient rune with the tip of his thumb. His eyes, once merely curious, now gleamed with an intensity that made Elian hold his breath. "An even more refined piece of work, stonemason," Eldrin murmured, without taking his eyes off the piece. "The patina, the wear, almost perfect, almost." He looked up at Elian, and his enigmatic smile deepened. "You have a talent for forgery, I must say, or for revelation. Which is it?" Elian swallowed hard. It's a rare find, sir, from a very ancient place." Eldrin chuckled, a dry sound that echoed in the shop. "Ancient, yes, but the hand that made it is much more recent, and far more skilled than most artisans today. You're not just a stonemason, are you? You're an artist." He placed the medallion back in Elian's hand, but didn't release it completely. "Tell me, stonemason, where did you learn to imitate time with such perfection?" The tension was almost unbearable. Elian felt cold sweat trickle down his back. I merely observed the ruins, sir, and tried to recreate the beauty of the past." Eldrin released the medallion, pushing it back to Elian. "Beauty, yes, and value. This one is worth more than the last. 18 silver coins. 18 silver coins. It was almost double what he had received before. Relief flooded Elian, but distrust remained. Eldrin was being too generous. "But," Eldrin continued, his eyes fixed on Elian's, "I have a piece of advice for you, stonemason. Or perhaps a warning. The Lord has a new interest in ancient artifacts, and in new finds. He has sent his guards to investigate, especially those that seem to come from forgotten places." Elian's heart leaped. The guard. It wasn't paranoia. "He is particularly interested in anything that might have been lost from the ancient kingdom," Eldrin added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "and he is a man who doesn't like secrets or people who keep them." Elian felt a shiver down his spine. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir. I'm just a stonemason." Eldrin smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course you are, and I am just a merchant, but we both know that truth is a malleable thing, isn't it? Especially when gold is involved." He pushed the 18 silver coins towards Elian. "Bring me more, but be more careful, stonemason. The city has eyes and ears everywhere, and the Lord, he has an insatiable appetite for all that glitters." Elian took the coins, feeling the weight of the new fortune and the burden of the warning. He left Eldrin's shop with the feeling that he had just escaped one trap, only to fall into another. The guard was still in the square, but now he seemed to be looking directly at Eldrin's shop, or at Elian. The path back to the mausoleum was a race against time and against fear. Every shadow seemed to lengthen, every sound amplified. He felt the guard's eyes on his back, even when he didn't see him. The mausoleum, once a refuge, now felt like a cage, and the king's treasure a bait. Upon arriving, Cale awaited him, his eyes full of hope. Ilara coughed faintly from her bed. The coins in his pocket were life, but Eldrin's warning was death. Elian knew the game had changed. He was no longer just a stonemason disguising gold. He was a target. The Lord was searching, and Eldrin, the astute merchant, was not an ally, but a player who was using Elian in his own dark game. Elian's silent war had escalated to a new level. He had more money, but less time. With each new piece of gold, he transformed into an heirloom. He dug his own grave deeper. The king's secret was no longer just a treasure. It was a curse that drew attention from all sides. And Elian, the humiliated stonemason, was at the center of it all, a master of deception, trapped between his children's lives and the fury of a kingdom. The next move would be decisive. The weight of the coins in Elian's pocket was a burden, not a blessing. Eldrin's warning echoed in his mind, each word a hammer striking his soul. The Lord has a new interest in ancient artifacts, and in new finds. The guard in the square, Eldrin's shop, the entire city now seemed like a trap, slowly closing. It wasn't paranoia, it was a cold, cutting certainty. The Lord knew, or at least suspected enough to send his hounds. Elian quickened his pace, his heart beating erratically. Every shadow seemed to harbor a pair of eyes, every whisper of the wind, an accusing voice. He felt the guard's gaze on his back, an invisible and oppressive presence. The mausoleum, once his refuge, now felt like a cage, and the king's treasure, a glittering bait for his own destruction. He could no longer hide, nor could he continue Eldrin's game. The next move would not just be decisive, it would be the last. Upon arriving at the mausoleum, the air within the stone walls felt even heavier. Kyle ran to him, his large eyes filled with a hope Elian felt he didn't deserve. Ilara coughed faintly from her bed, the sound a cruel reminder of the urgency of their situation. The coins were life, yes, but time was running out. Elian sat beside Ilara, stroking her fine hair. He looked at Kyle, who watched him with an innocence he needed to protect at all costs. There would be no more medallions. There would be no more visits to Eldrin. The silent war had reached its climax. That night, under the cloak of darkness, Elian descended into the cellar for the last time. The flickering light of the lamp danced over the piles of gold and bottles of wine, revealing a gleam that now seemed sinister. It was the fortune of a kingdom, yes, but also his death sentence. He couldn't take everything, he couldn't risk it. He needed an escape, not an empire. With trembling but decisive hands, Elian began to select, not the heaviest gold, but the easiest to transport, the most discreet. He chose some of the rarest bottles of wine, not to sell, but as a last, desperate bargaining chip, or perhaps a gift for an uncertain future. He hid the gold and wine in reinforced cloth bags, made from old bed linens, small enough to be carried by him and Cale if necessary. He worked all night, sealing the crypt's entrance with a final layer of mortar, not to hide it, but to make it look abandoned, forgotten. He covered the cellar entrance with stones and rubble, blending it perfectly with the mausoleum floor. If anyone came looking, they would find only a ruin, not a treasure. At dawn, the plan was ready. He would not flee through the front door. The mausoleum, with its thick walls and dark history, held a secret Elian had discovered long ago. A small drainage tunnel that led out beyond the cemetery walls, used to drain accumulated rainwater. It was tight, dark, and dangerous, but it was the only way out. He explained to Cale, his voice choked, that they would be taking a journey. A long journey. Kyle, though confused, felt the urgency in his father's voice and nodded, his eyes fixed and determined. Ilara, still weak, was wrapped in blankets, her face pale, but her gaze, now clearer, fixed on her father. The sound came before he could finish. Heavy footsteps approaching the mausoleum. Gruff voices, the creak of the cemetery's main gate. They were here. The Lord hadn't waited. Elian grabbed the bags, one in each hand, and Cale took a smaller one. "Quick, son," he whispered, pushing Kyle towards the small opening, hidden behind a fallen tombstone, which he had dug and camouflaged in recent days. The tunnel was narrow, dark, and smelled of damp earth. "Father, what about Ilara?" Kyle asked, his eyes full of fear. "I'll take her. Go. Don't look back. Find the stream, follow it east. I'll catch up." Elian scooped Ilara into his arms, protecting her against his chest. He heard the pounding on the mausoleum door, the sound of splintering wood. There was no time. He pushed Kyle into the tunnel, and the boy, with a courage Elian didn't know he possessed, crawled into the darkness. Elian turned to the door. The guards were breaking it down. He knew he had no chance to fight. His plan was not to confront, but to disappear. He crouched, squeezing himself into the opening, his body aching, but his mind focused. Ilara coughed, and he held her tighter. The sound of the mausoleum door bursting open echoed behind him. Shouts, "He's here! Search for him!" Elian crawled, dragging himself through the damp, dark tunnel, the smell of earth and mold filling his lungs. He felt panic, but the love for his children drove him. He was a stonemason, accustomed to tight spaces and hard labor. He was a father, and he would do anything. Lee, the faint morning light appeared ahead. Kyle was waiting, his face smudged with dirt, but his eyes gleaming with relief. Elian emerged from the tunnel, gasping, Ilara in his arms. They heard the guards' shouts from outside the mausoleum, the frustration in their voices. They had lost their prey. The Lord would not find his treasure, nor his stonemason. Elian looked back at the cemetery and the mausoleum, now just a distant silhouette against the morning sky. He had been humiliated, forced to live among the dead. But there, among the shadows, he had found life. He had found a treasure not just of gold and wine, but of courage and resilience. He was no longer the humiliated stonemason. He was Elian, the man who had defied a lord, outwitted a cunning merchant, and above all, saved his children. The gold in his bags was enough for a new life, far from the Lord's shadow and the city's intrigues. The king's secret would remain buried, a forgotten legend in the depths of the mausoleum of the pestilent, perhaps waiting for another stonemason, another destiny. With Cale by his side and Ilara in his arms, Elian turned east, towards the rising sun, towards an uncertain but free future. The silent war had ended, and Elian, the stonemason, had won.